Welcome to another episode of Athens and Jerusalem. Let's begin where we can't escape. Let's begin with Logos.
Now, I would say that this openness, this being in the world, this referring to the world, to objects in the world, what I would like to call self-transcendence, this is disappearing as soon as you project a human being into a lower dimension than its own dimension.
Point of the V goes up to the nuclear explosion that created it.
Tell me this, Dr. Oppenheimer. Do you ever become frightened at what you're finding out here in this area that can't be measured in either time or space?
You see, that's a real point.
Do not be afraid. Open your hearts, open up your hearts.
Open up your hearts to Athens and Jerusalem. The infants of our culture, united, independent, polarized, and even bloody. Athens, the cradle of wisdom and rationality. Jerusalem, the cradle of faith and spirituality. In this podcast, we look at reunion. Could reason be more than modern secular skepticism? And could spirituality be more than belief? Welcome to another episode of the Athens and Jerusalem podcast. Last time we discussed holiness and what space there is for holiness in the modern world. In the end of the podcast, we started to discuss about praying. And I think as a Norwegian, and especially maybe it's me because I haven't done praying, and I think I have a very strange opinion about what praying is. So I think we should start with just to discuss praying, to pray, and what it means. What does it mean to pray in the modern world? I see you are nodding. Who will start?
Yeah. Well, what is your opinion of what prayer is? Why don't we start with that?
Okay. I do, because in Norwegian word for pray is be. And that means to ask or to beg. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of my problems is that I have this idea that praying has to do something that you are asking for something to someone that is not, how to say it, to the mysterious part of reality. Mm-hmm. But so you're trying to ask if someone could help you, or to ask for someone else to be saved or something like that. That's my opinion, and that's also why I think you have a little bit different opinion on the phenomena.
I certainly agree, and sign on to that sort of sense of dis-ease about that limited definition of prayer. One way we could go forward is to look at other ways of defining what prayer is, and I've sketched out 4 different ways. So maybe we could pick one or and run with that, or exclude some. So the first way is the one that you just mentioned, and which I think is maybe the common idea of prayer, which is a kind of petition to an unseen force for something. In a way, it's like it's a conversation, but maybe it's a one-way conversation. You're asking for something, you're hoping to get something, and usually it takes the place of words, and sometimes the words are ritualized. Sometimes the words are written down beforehand, and these are words that you repeat that have already been written down by someone else. Sometimes it's your own words. But another way of thinking about prayer is something which has that same kind of spirit, but is without words. A prayer that is not ritualized, it doesn't take the form of a mantra. It's something that transcends and rises above words and letters. It transcends that murmur of syllables and sounds that is like that we think of as the prayerful state. But we can think of a further, I guess I'm going in levels of abstraction. We can also think of further a kind of living in a state of prayer, where that state of prayer is something that one could be in throughout the whole day. it's not a particular moment in time, a sacred space or a sacred time that we were talking about last week that one carves out to have this encounter with the sacred, but it's something that permeates one's state of being in a more or less consistent or constant way. But at one even further level of abstraction, we can think of prayer as something which is not restricted to the human species, but is something which in some way characterizes the universe. Everything is praying in its own way, just like everything is conscious in its own way. Of course, we have to, at this point, we have to more or less radically redefine what we mean by prayer, what we mean by consciousness. But I think it can nevertheless be a helpful step to make, even if we then go back and say, well, that's not what we mean. It can be helpful to think of prayer all the way to that end of the spectrum as something which is, a posture towards existence, which is taken by many things. The plant prays in a sense when it stretches its leaves towards the sun and it angles them so that they're maximally receptive to the light of the sun, and when it places it in in the best place to catch those rays of the sun. And if we think of that as also a state of prayer in its own way, and in doing so, we're not trying to say then that, well, if everything prays, then nothing prays. Once you define something in a way that everything has that, then in a way you're saying that at the same time nothing has it. But that's not what I want to do with this. It's more trying to get at what is prayer behind the words and the syllables and the sounds that are said in the prayer. It has something to do, I think, with two things. It has something to do with putting oneself in a state of lowliness or humility, and this makes most sense when we think about it in terms of human beings. And secondly, has something to do with putting oneself in a state of receptivity or listening. One is sort of ready to catch something that's out there, which may not be obvious, which may be invisible. But to catch it the best, that receptivity has to be joined with a kind of lowliness or humility. Like the great, who was it who said, the ocean is as vast as it is because it puts itself lower than all of the rivers, and that's why all the rivers flow into it. So there's something attractive fundamentally about putting oneself in a state of humility, and it's in that state of humility and receptivity that you can hear that still small voice, in the words of Elijah, of the guidance that might be there, that permeates the universe in a way, but that can only be heard in that state of prayer. So something about emptying out the ego and being receptive to something. And that goes way beyond prayer. That goes way beyond, the words of it. It then becomes something that I can absolutely, sign on to as someone who also shares the sense of, I don't know, unease at how prayer can often become a very formulaic thing.
Now, since you're a physicist, I would like to also, bring into in this beautiful context that you just gave us another specific analogy from physics that I'm sure you're aware of as well, and that is the phenomenon of magnetism. Because what actually turns a body of metal into a magnet, if I understand it correctly, is the rearrangement, as it were, or the reorientation of the molecular structure. And then all of a sudden, this same sort of collection of molecules that was devoid of any special power can achieve a power and an attractive power. And I wonder whether you would like to sort of further elucidate on on whether this would be one way of looking at prayer as a way to sort of tap into the energies in existence.
That's I think, a really powerful way of thinking about it, because what makes a material magnetic is a kind of inner alignment of atoms.
Yeah.
And if we think of our consciousness as something which may be diffused, which may be focused in all sorts of different directions, but if it's aligned in a particular way, in some sort of coherent way, then it unlocks some capacity that was there. In the case of a magnet, the capacity to attract other magnets. In a way, though, the magnet is itself a manifestation of an even deeper principle from physics, since we're opening that door of thinking about um, it in physics terms, and that's the notion of symmetry
Mhm.
and broken symmetry, and it's a huge topic, and I'll just, I don't know, maybe say a couple of things about it. The the idea of symmetry is the idea of what one way of thinking about symmetry is that a truly symmetrical situation is one in which the direction you pick doesn't matter. You switch from one direction to another direction, and the whole thing is really the same. One of the deeper principles of symmetry in terms of time is that pick a point in time that you define a system, and if the system is the same at different points in time, then something called energy is conserved. So there's a deep relationship between what are called symmetry transformations and certain deep conservation laws. So this is one of the really, for me, most fascinating and deep ideas that physics has discovered over the last century. But I think it can help us think a little bit about prayer too, because prayer in a way manifests what we would call in physics terms a broken symmetry. That is, what it suggests is that there is a directionality. The universe is so structured that consciousness and its development in time represents a sort of preferred direction to things.
Mhm.
Obviously not a direction in spatial terms, but a direction in consciousness terms. That there is a preferred direction of consciousness, and that direction of consciousness, if we take it to its endpoint, becomes the same as the beginning point. If it's true that that the universe is cyclical in the end, that's one way of thinking about it. And so that could tell us something about the phenomenon of prayer as well. Not in terms of advancing this or that dogmatic formulation or this or that religion's conception of it, but the idea of religion as a whole, or the idea of prayer as a whole, as telling us that if we orient our consciousness, if we orient our intention in a particular direction, and that particular direction is not just any direction, it's a particular direction, then it, just like that when the atoms of a magnet align and it releases that, or it enables that magnetism to emerge, when we orient our consciousness in a particular direction, it also allows something to emerge. What is the thing to emerge? It draws consciousness onward towards, towards that omega point, which is the same as the alpha point. That's one way of that's one way I've tried to bring in a little bit through the back door a physics concept. But I find it really interesting and exciting to think about because it takes prayer in a way, then it takes prayer out of the realm of the supernatural, and it brings fully into the realm of the natural.
Mhm.
But that's my bias. I mean, not everyone wants to think about prayer in that way, and one has to be aware of that as well. There isn't just a single correct way of thinking about this phenomenon. When I was younger, I prayed very, very devoutly, as a child, using words of prayer in ways that I found very fulfilling, comforting, confirming for the identity that I had at the time, my identity, which has evolved over time. And so through my own personal experience, I see the wisdoms and the benefit to seeing and experiencing prayer through different lenses.
Because I would say, I think I've never tried to pray in the first way of the understanding. But then if you change it to number 3, then maybe I sometimes I actually am able to to be or to live according
Mhm.
to this, like a state of mind or a state of prayer.
Mhm.
But it's also it seems very, very hard. I mean, it's very okay. It's not supernatural, but it's also it's a very demanding way of living in a modern world with all these.
Mm-hmm.
How often do we have the time, or do we take the time to actually?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very good. Yes, I mean, I think that especially if one refers to the more mystical traditions of different world religions, I mean, the state of prayer has something to do with uh, not only being in the state of love, I mean, love in the sense that one is, as it were, consumed by something other than one's own self and one's own needs. But even, I think, at least in certain traditions, there's this analogy of intoxication, that it is sort of like becoming unaware of all of those things that you were just referring to, Knut, and like being intoxicated by the beauty and the majesty and the perfection of the divine, so that everything else sort of becomes really meaningless, or at least of secondary meaning.
Maybe it was last night when I opened the window when I was going to bed, and it's really cold in nights still in Norway. It's below zero,
Mm,
and I tasted this
mm,
cold air into
yes.
my, and I really felt that like the whole universe was I was part,
Mm,
really
mm,
small
yes. Yes.
human being, like a small atom, just smelling the
Wow.
universe.
How beautiful. How beautiful.
Mm.
Mm,
But
yeah.
if I should try to argue more in defense of the number one position, I would say that because we often say that hope is an important part of human
Mm,
existence, and praying as asking for something is to have hope.
mm,
Is it praying, and also a very important part of human existence?
I'm not sure what we gain by putting really hard lines around prayer and saying this is prayer and that's not prayer. Maybe the maybe one way of asking or answering that question for ourselves is by asking, well, what's the result of it? You know, it's a true prayer is one which has a certain result. You know, it has a result of um, of softening rather than hardening our boundaries. It has a result
mm,
of increasing our receptivity rather than raising up walls between us and other experiences, other people, other sources of inspiration. A true prayer would be whatever gives that result, rather than
mm,
something
mm,
which fulfills some sort of preliminary dogmatic criterion. That's one thing I think that makes prayer so, I don't know, so unfashionable in the present day. It's association with dogma. It's association with, oh, this is a law of God. This is something you have to do. Uh, with the implication, if you don't do this, there are consequences for it. And I also, I also rebel against that idea of prayer as law. But if I think of, if I think of it in the sense that, well, exercise is a law, right? The law of exercise. Like if you don't exercise your body, you become weak and unhealthy, and it's not good for you. So everyone ought to exercise. We
mm,
don't think of it as a law in the sense that there are penalties of society if you don't exercise, but the law of exercise, I think, is the same kind of law as the law of prayer. If you don't pray on a regular basis, if you don't exercise on a regular basis, in both there are reasons why one should do it and consequences for not doing it. But those consequences are always self-inflicted.
yeah. But there's something also in that what you can call the first concept, this sort of like prayer as begging. And I think that also has maybe sort of different layers and depths, because I think that when humanity was very much childlike, prayer maybe was felt more like, I don't know, a child asking a dad for, like, could you get me this thing that I really like, or something like that, and wasn't there back in the 70s there was this popular song, "Oh God, would you buy me a Mercedes Benz," or something like that.
Yeah.
And I think that's sort of that's I mean, I think that as it has been already mentioned, that prayer has something to do with opening up to receiving something. But I think the question is whether what you want to receive is something that you, especially sort of a superficial point of view, have a desire for, or whether that desire becomes to receive whatever is conducive to your human blossoming. And so you're saying, just, please give me whatever I need now to be able to grow as a human being, whatever it may be, even if it is like, getting into trouble or whatever, but whatever just is conducive to my growth. And then you sort of, and I think that's where you were saying, Stephen, that we need this humility. So you say, I know, and I think this is part of the aspect of prayer that is also, I think, it's challenging for modern man to actually put oneself in this state of, would I say, in a sense, powerlessness. Because we talk today so much about empowerment, like us being in control of everything and being able to do whatever we want. And here I think it's the opposite, saying there's something greater and wiser than me. And please, would you kindly, provide me with what I need in order to grow and to be open to whatever that is. And I think in some sense it is a little bit similar to a true student-master relationship, where the student comes to the master and is not asking for some specific thing to learn, but saying, like, what do you think I need to learn? Especially if you think of the student-master relationship in sort of Far Eastern traditions. Almost Karate Kid comes to mind. Anyway, so that kind of a thing where you're saying, I don't know what I need, and whatever you say, I'll do it because I trust that you want the best for me. So something along those lines, I think, is, and so there's an element of humility, there's an element of receptivity. I think there's also an element of trust that there is some source that actually cares for you and from which you can get guidance or energies that are going to be conducive to your growth.
The universe is here for us, and sometimes we have to ask of the universe.
Yes,
and I think there's profound wisdoms in that. I mean, it isn't necessarily just some irrational superstition. Something about the universe is aligned with our consciousness, and something about putting oneself in a state of lowliness and supplication and asking unlocks something. And that's the wisdom of humanity over centuries, across cultures, across religions. And it's something that I don't know, it's a bit of a litmus test too. If a modern idea comes along, you can sort of use this litmus test, like, is this compatible with a state of receptivity in prayer? I'm just thinking of the philosophy of Nietzsche for all its brilliance and for all of the, I think, correct analysis and diagnosis of some of the ills of the modern age. His solution had nothing to do with lowliness and humility and prayer. His solution was a kind of valorization of the individual as their own sort of God, which in a way is the exact opposite. It's the exact opposite of prayer in the sense of humility and receptivity. And I think one has enough time and space between us and that particular philosophical moment to see to be able to judge it by its results as well.
I think it's often easier to diagnose than to bring the medicine to the table.
Yeah.
And that's, but also what we are, or what you are saying now is that to pray is actually like a medicine, for the soul. It has something to do to bring to the soul that. And that was
an
also
elixir.
Yeah. I think that's also when I presented one of the prey from the dialogue of Plato. And that's also interesting that he could end a dialogue with a pray, just saying that this is the only thing we have left is the hope.
Yes, yes,
That's what we
yes,
okay, because we
yes.
and I think also he talks about how when we like food is something that we are taking to give a healthy body. Then thoughts and philosophy is something we are trying to bring to the soul, to nurture the
Beautiful.
soul.
I think that's a lovely concept, prayer as sort of a nutrition for the soul. Yeah, that's a but there's, I mean, I just, I don't know, in a crazy way, I'm reminded of this very well-known Russian folk song that I'm sure you may have heard. It's called Stenka Razin, and it's a story about this Russian Cossack leader who becomes who falls in love with this Persian girl. I don't know, she may have even been a princess or something, and so brings her into the camp, and and then they go into the tent, and like all the soldiers are mocking him, saying, "Hey, what's happened to you? You used to be a great soldier. What are you doing now? Just sitting with a girl in a tent?" And uh, and so then in the end he gets so disturbed by that he actually brings the girl out from the tent and throws her into the river Volga, and sort of to show that no, he's not attached to such thing. And I think that sort of shows that how in a way we are so vain in that, or that we are so afraid about, as it were, subduing ourselves, or losing control, as it were, or being seen as being weak when we are in a state of love. And so I think that much of the traditions, at least in Middle East, there's a lot of poetry about love relationship between sort of a Romeo Juliet kind of thing. And I think it has maybe a deeper layer that talks about what we are now talking about human beings falling in love with and forgetting themselves, and
Mm.
becoming one with something higher.
I may have mentioned this a few months ago, but one of the most beautiful expressions of that for me is in the story of Joseph and Jacob from the Old Testament, which was repeated in the Quran with some additional details. And here we have this beautiful imagery of this love between a child and his father.
Mm,
Uh, but the child is absent. The child has been taken away as a slave, into Egypt, and the father remains behind in Israel. And after some time and many adventures, and there's all sorts of other great aspects to this story. Joseph wants to send word back to his father that he exists. He wants to announce his
mm,
presence, but he can't go himself, so he sends a messenger bearing his shirt.
mhm,
And Jacob at this point has gone blind, can't see the evidence, but when brought the shirt of Joseph,
mm,
he can still inhale the fragrance of the garment,
mm, mm,
and
mm,
that speaks to me very
mm, mm,
movingly
mm.
of the reality of prayer.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah,
prayer.
beautifully.
Maybe we have words of the beloved, the one that we've designated as our beloved in whatever faith tradition. Our prophet left behind words, and those words are the shirt. And we can focus on the thread count of that shirt. We can focus on the color of
Mm,
it. We can
mm,
focus
mm.
on the style of it. We're
Beautiful.
missing the point if we focus. Similarly with the words of a prayer, we're missing the point if we're focusing on the words of the prayer, because the whole point is that the prayer brings a fragrance.
Oh, beautiful.
Somehow we have to be alive to that, and our
Mm,
senses have to
mm.
be open to that, and that's where the humility and the receptivity comes in, to be
Yeah.
able to detect that fragrance, because it's a still small voice. It's a something that one requires refined sensibilities to detect, but it's there. And it's there in all things. This fragrance of Joseph's garment is there in
Mm,
every
mm,
atom of the
mm.
universe, if we have the senses to detect it.
But that was beautiful. I think that was a beautiful explanation. And I think that, love altogether is I want to say risky thing, but no, I didn't mean really risky. But I mean, love means actually, it doesn't it, putting down your defense system and opening yourself up to being vulnerable and accessible, as it were, by someone else. And if you're not willing to do that, you will never experience love. And I think many people do not want true love because they don't want to put themselves into that perceived state of sort of
Uncontrollability.
exactly
being
exactly
hurt.
beautiful. Yes,
Yeah.
exactly, yes. And yet that is the most wonderful situation when you can open yourself totally up and know that there are arms that receive you, and that you can so in many ways maybe prayer is in a way taking us to our origin.
Mhm. Yeah.
When you talk about this, about control and uncontrollability, it reminds me of Hartmut Rosa, and he says that the more we are trying to control our, both ourselves and everything around us, the more uncontrollable will it become. Even though
Mm,
but it's becoming uncontrollable on a different level than if you
mm,
are trying to open yourself, to
mm,
risk of falling in love, or
mm,
but
mm,
it's going to be like a fight that is accelerating, that you have to fight everything faster and faster to try to cope with everything that you are not being able to control.
mm.
But also that there is a discussion, I think, in this about what is the most powerful way of being, to give love, or to,
Mm.
how to say it, to be a powerful person in a more, to be strong, as a
Yes,
fighter.
exactly. Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah. Mhm,
And
mhm.
there's always been a discussion, what kind of existence is the strongest, is the most
Mm,
powerful
mm,
of it.
mm,
Yeah, if we discuss, if we see in history, we will say that a lot of person we know about in history has been powerful in this fighting manner. But
yeah.
then we have also, we have some some persons, some stories that are really powerful and seems to have even greater impact on reality in a more, a broader sense.
Jesus and Buddha. I mean, these are people who didn't project power in any traditional sense. It was the opposite.
Mm,
Yeah.
mm. Yeah, there is this. I'm sure Stephen knows this even better than I do, but there is this Middle Eastern sort of poetic story about a bunch of animals that came across a candle for the first time, and they were trying to find out what it is. So they went by one by one, close to it, and each one came back giving some description of it. And then it came the turn of the moth, the sort of night butterfly, and then it approached it, and it was so sort of enamored by it
Enraptured.
that it just flew into the candle and was of course burned by it. And then the poem says that the one who really understood it came never back to tell about it.
Yeah. Yep.
I think that's very beautiful.
Yeah.
It is. But it also says something that if as long as we stay alive, and then we have to keep the distance. But of course, in the moment we die, we actually we are getting burned.
Mhm.
Then we will feel it.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah, but or actually this of course raised the question of what is really to be alive, isn't it? And I think one could say that the moth lives or sort of gives further fuel to the light of the candle, and that is maybe the best way to be alive rather than
Mhm.
being far away from it,
Mhm.
in a way safe. So I think that would be one thing, one way also to think of prayer as sort of becoming one with what is truly important in existence.
Mm.
Is it possible to strip away the dogmatism that has become so identified with prayer in a
Mm,
way that, I mean, if we're thinking of also of education, prayer in school is one of these huge
mm, mm,
cultural
mm,
flashpoints in the U.S. Um,
mm,
Obviously, because prayer is associated with Christian prayer and a particular way of praying, particular words of prayer. Obviously, given the constitutional structure of the United States, you don't want to privilege one religion over other religions. Um, but is it possible to bring prayer in as a people ought to know how to pray?
mm,
I think we have enough collective wisdom uh, as a human race to know that this is a valuable skill to have, and
mm,
but also recognizing that different cultures and different people within given cultures uh, pray in different ways. They might not even use the word prayer. Maybe they use the word meditation. Maybe they use some other
mm,
word entirely. Um, is there a way to strip out the dogmatism um, to without stripping out the essence of it, uh, in a way that enables it to become a part of a curriculum that's a non-sectarian curriculum?
yeah.
I like the
Uh,
question.
mm,
I guess the answer for the moment is I don't think any of any curriculum has pray as a skill,
Yeah.
but
Beautiful,
they have a
beautiful.
lot of
Yeah,
skills in the
yeah,
curriculums. So
yeah. That's beautiful. Yeah, really, really. That was a beautiful way of putting it. Yeah. To learn the skills of prayer would probably ennoble us as human beings. And I think yes, it is very important that as long as prayer is just that, you know, saying certain words or making certain movements, because I mean, quite frankly, there have been and this is not connected with any one religion, but I mean, there have been followers of different religions that today are, you know, horrible, horribly cruel people, people who do horribly cruel things and still pray 5 times a day or whatever, 3 times a day or every day. And so I think that somehow also a sort of a litmus test for the meaningfulness of prayer is what it results in. If prayer does not result in you becoming ennobled and and somehow a more refined human being, then one can ask the question, has it really been prayer?
Yeah. As as you're talking about prayer and Plato, I was wondering which dialogue ends with the prayer. So I did a little search, and it's the closing prayer of the Phaedrus, which is short enough for us to read, and it led me to another thought. Uh,
Mm.
the closing prayer is, "Beloved Pan, and all ye other gods who haunt this place, give me beauty in the inward soul, and may the outward and inward man be at one. May I reckon the wise to be the wealthy, and may I have such a quantity of gold as a temperate man and he only can bear and carry. Anything more? The prayer, I think, is enough for me." It's really
Mm.
quite, I find it quite beautiful
Mm.
and
Mm.
quite moving in its own way. And I love how he's addressing Pan, the god Pan, who
Mm.
we think of as
Mm.
this is a god of what of you know
everything.
satyr, but he's a god of nature. He's
Mm.
the god of
Mm.
the animal spirits, really.
Mm.
Um,
Mm.
but to address Pan as a god might seem like, oh, that's a very anti-Christian thing, right? The Christian
Mm.
God is
Mm.
so above nature. But here's an example of how something of the spirit of the sacred, of the spirit of prayer can enter into and through these other sorts of deities. And it reminds me of what to me was an extremely moving chapter of The Wind in the Willows, this old children's story that I don't know, it's probably out of fashion these days, but in a chapter of The Wind in the Willows, this little mole gets lost in the forest, and he's discovered in the arms of Pan. And the way it's
Mm.
described, the animal's going on a search for this small creature and finding it. And the way it's described is, and you just have to read it, I can't do justice to it, is very much infused with the cadences of the sacred. And it's completely in a non-traditional Christian context, but this is prayer. This is the sacred. This is very much that idea of if one asks for something with all sincerity, then one receives it.
Yeah, that was a beautiful, I think, way to bring this particular conversation perhaps to a conclusion. Thank you so much, Knut Ove, for introducing this topic. I've never, I must say, during all my life, I don't think I've ever had such a conversation about prayer. It was inspiring and opened up to me new perspectives still at this late stage of my development. So thank you so much.
Fully agree. I also think it's been a very nice conversation. And I think for me, when you talked, and if I should try to sum it up, for me, in some way, to pray is an attempt to be a participant in reality or in world, and not only a spectator.
Wow. Lovely. Lovely. That's a beautiful way. Yeah. Wonderful.
So, okay. So
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you for
That
listening.
was lovely. Thank you so much.
You have been listening to Athens and Jerusalem, created by Cameron Namdar, Stephen Phelps, and Knut Ove Essay. Nora Juel is the broadcast voice and technical support. Music is pieces of Edvard Grieg's Morning Mood. The voices in the intro are Viktor Frankl, interview with Robert Oppenheimer, and Pope John Paul II. Thank you for listening, and please check out another episode.